My mother kicked me out of my own house to live with her boyfriend. Years later, I came back and legally evicted her, leaving her with nothing while I renovated my inheritance. I'm 26 years old, work as an accountant at a mid-sized firm, and about 3 months ago, I made a decision that basically blew up what was left of my relationship with my mother and her family. The thing is, when I was 15, my father died of a completely unexpected heart attack. Like, one day he was fine, and the next he just didn't wake up. And that was devastating, obviously. Because my dad was my favorite person in the world, the kind of father who went to all my soccer games and helped me with my math homework even when he was tired from work. What I didn't know at the time, because I was a teenager and didn't understand anything about legal matters, was that my father had left everything. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything. In a very specific will in my name. The house where we lived, 2 other properties he had for rent, his savings, everything. My mother, Laura, didn't receive absolutely anything because it turns out they never legally married. They lived together for like 18 years but never signed papers. And my father apparently had his reasons for structuring things that way. Though honestly, at the time I didn't understand them at all. The lawyer who handled the will explained everything to me when I was like 15 and a half. I remember perfectly because it was in his office that smelled weird like old coffee and had those huge diplomas on the walls. And he told me, "Zachary, legally all of this is yours, but obviously your mother can continue living in the house until you're of legal age and decide what to do." I was confused, sad, and honestly didn't care much at the time because I had just lost my dad and all I wanted was for everything to go back to the way it was before. My mother was furious when she found out. She was screaming that it was unfair, that she had dedicated almost 2 decades of her life to my father, that she deserved something. But the will was clear, and there was nothing to be done about it. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. All the signs were there that things were going to get ugly, but I was a grieving teenager and didn't pay attention. What happened next was that my mother basically moved on to the next stage of her life at a speed that left me in shock. Like, my father had been dead for less than 6 months when she started dating this guy, Martin, who worked in construction or something like that, was like 45 years old, had 2 grown children from his first marriage, and had this attitude that he knew everything better than everyone. At first, I tried to be understanding. I mean, my mother had the right to remake her life, I guess. But the way she did it was so fast and so in my face that it made me feel like my father had never mattered. Martin started showing up at the house, first on weekends, then he'd stay several days, and eventually, like 8 months after my father died, he was basically living there full time. And not just him, his 2 kids too. Evan, who was like 18 at the time, and Heather, who was 19, started coming constantly, using our stuff, eating our food, acting like the house was theirs too. My mother changed completely. Or maybe she was always like that and I never noticed when my father was alive. I don't know. She started treating me like I was the visitor in my own house. Or, well, technically in my own house according to the will, but she acted like I was the one who was extra. She spent all her time doing things with Martin and his kids, like going to the movies, special dinners, even a beach trip that I wasn't invited to. And when I asked them why I couldn't go, they'd say things like, "We need time as a new family," or, "We don't want you to feel uncomfortable." Can you believe it? I was her son, the only son she had, and she was treating me like a stranger while she played happy family with her boyfriend and his kids she barely knew. Things got really bad when I was 17, almost 18. Martin started acting like he owned the house. Like, he'd tell me what I could and couldn't do, establish new rules without consulting me. One day, he even changed the Wi-Fi schedule so it would turn off at 10 p.m. because, according to him, young people spent too much time on the internet. I tried to talk to my mother about it. I told her, "Mom, this is my house legally. Dad left it to me. Martin has no right to come here and act like he's my father or the owner of anything." And she took Martin's side, obviously, told me I was ungrateful, that Martin was just trying to help establish structure in my life, that my father would have wanted me to be more respectful. That hurt me so much because she was using my father's memory to justify her new boyfriend treating me badly in the house that my father left specifically to me. The straw that broke the camel's back was one night when I got home late from a party. It was Friday, I was 17 years old and had gone to a friend's house. I got home around 1 a.m., which, yeah, okay, was late, but it's not like I had done anything terrible. Martin was waiting for me in the living room, sitting there on the couch like he was my dad waiting to scold me, and he started yelling at me, telling me that this was his house now, that while I lived under his roof, I had to follow his rules. And when I tried to defend myself and tell him that technically this was my house and he was the one living under my roof, he turned red with fury and pushed me against the wall. My mother heard the commotion, came downstairs, and instead of defending me or asking if I was okay, she yelled at me about how dare I disrespect Martin that way, that she was fed up with my attitude, that if I couldn't live in peace with them, then maybe I should look for another place to stay. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake in my room thinking, is she really kicking me out of my own house? The house my father left me specifically to make sure I'd be okay? The next day, I tried to talk to her more calmly. I explained that I understood she wanted to be with Martin, but it wasn't fair for them to treat me like that in the property that was legally mine. That if anything, we had forgotten that all of this was because my father wanted it that way. And she told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Your father is dead, Zachary, and dead people don't pay bills or maintain this house. I do that and Martin does. So either you adapt or you leave." I froze. I literally felt like they had thrown a bucket of cold water on me, because she had just confirmed that to her I was less important than her new boyfriend and his stepchildren. A week later, after another fight where Martin basically ordered me to clean the garage because according to him, I didn't contribute anything to the house, my mother sat me down and told me she had made a decision, that Martin and she believed that the best thing for everyone was for me to go live with my paternal grandparents for a while so we could have space and calm things down. I told her, "Mom, this is my house. If anyone should leave, it's them." And she answered that no, that she had lived there for almost 20 years, that she wasn't going anywhere, that I was the one causing problems, and therefore, I was the one who had to leave. At that moment, I realized there was no way to reason with her. She was completely on Martin's side, and if I stayed, it was going to be constant hell. So I agreed to leave, but I made it very clear to her that this wasn't going to stay like this forever. My paternal grandparents, Clara and Oliver, welcomed me without asking questions, they just hugged me and told me I could stay as long as I needed. They knew about the will, obviously. My dad was their son, and they had been present when everything was legally arranged, and they were furious with my mother for the way she had treated me, but they didn't want to get directly involved in the conflict because they didn't want to make things worse for me. I lived to them the last months of high school and then throughout college, which was like 5 years total because I studied accounting, and it took me an extra year to graduate because I worked part-time to help with my expenses. During all that time, my mother and I basically didn't talk. She never called to see how I was, never invited me to anything. It was like she had completely replaced her real son with her instant new family with Martin. Meanwhile, my mother and Martin continued living in my house as if it were theirs. They didn't pay rent, obviously. I didn't ask them for anything because honestly, I was focused on finishing college and didn't want more drama. But every time I thought about the situation, my blood boiled. They basically had a comfortable life thanks to the property my father left me without paying anything, while I worked and studied and lived with my grandparents in a much smaller house. The other 2 properties I inherited were rented out, and that money went into an inaccessible account that my father's lawyer had set up for me. So I had some passive income, but it wasn't a fortune. Enough to help with college, but not to live super comfortably. When I finally graduated, I was like 23 years old, got the accounting job and started thinking seriously about what I wanted to do with the properties. I talked to my grandparents, to the lawyer, to some friends, and everyone basically told me the same thing, that it was my property, that I could do whatever I wanted with it, that I didn't owe my mother anything after how she had treated me. I decided I wanted to renovate the main house, the one that had been my home with my father, and rent it out to have better monthly income, or maybe even sell it eventually if I got a good offer. I spent like 2 more years gathering the courage to confront the situation. I don't know why I waited so long. I guess part of me still had hope that my mother would realize what she had done and try to fix things. But obviously that never happened. About 4 months ago, when I was already 26 years old, I made the decision. I hired a new lawyer, more aggressive than the previous one, and explained the whole situation to him. He told me that legally I had every right to reclaim my property, that I could give an eviction notice of 30 days or even less depending on the situation, and that if my mother resisted, we could take her to court and we'd win without problem. But I didn't want to do things that way from the start. She was still my mother after all. So I decided to wait until she and Martin went on vacation, which they did every year like in October, and take advantage to change the locks and leave them a note explaining that I needed them to vacate the property. I waited for them to leave, confirmed with a neighbor that there was no one in the house, and went with a locksmith who changed all the locks in one afternoon. I entered the house for the first time in years and almost cried, honestly, because they had changed everything. It didn't look anything like the house where I grew up with my father. They had painted the walls horrible colors, removed family photos and replaced them with photos of Martin and his kids. They had even thrown away some furniture that belonged to my father and replaced them with cheap things. It made me so angry to see how they had completely erased my dad's memory from his own house that at that moment I knew I was doing the right thing by reclaiming it. I left a note on the kitchen table that said something like, "Mom, this house has been legally mine since Dad died 11 years ago. I've decided to reclaim the property. You have 2 weeks starting today to get your things out and turn in any copies of keys you have. If you need help finding a new place, I can give you information about available apartments in the area." And yeah, I know, it sounds cold, but it's just that I didn't know how else to handle the situation after years of being treated like garbage by my own mother. They came back from their vacation 3 days later, and, as expected, they went crazy. Martin tried to open the door, couldn't, and started banging and screaming, calling me everything, saying he was going to call the police because I had changed the locks on his house. My mother called me crying, hysterical, screaming at me how could I do this to them? Where were they supposed to go? That they didn't have money saved to rent another place. I told her very calmly that they had 11 years living for free in my property to save money, that wasn't my problem, and that they had 2 weeks legally to vacate. She started with the emotional blackmail, telling me that my father would be disappointed in me, that I was a horrible son, that after everything she did for me, this is how I repaid her. I reminded her that she was the one who kicked me out of my own house when I was 17 years old, that she chose Martin over me, and that now I was simply claiming what was always mine. I hung up the phone and blocked her because I knew she wasn't going to stop. The next few days were chaos of messages, calls from unknown numbers. Even Martin showed up at my work trying to confront me, but I had talked to security beforehand, so they didn't let him through. A week after changing the locks, my mother managed to contact me through a cousin's phone and begged me to meet to talk. I agreed, but took my grandfather Oliver with me as a witness because I didn't trust that there wouldn't be drama. We met at a coffee shop, and that's when my mother dropped the bomb. She told me that Heather, Martin's stepdaughter, was pregnant with like 5 months, that she and her boyfriend didn't have money, that they were going to live with them, and that if I kicked them out, I'd basically be putting a pregnant young woman on the street. I asked her, "And that's my problem. How exactly?" "Heather is nothing to me. You decided to take care of her when you chose to be with Martin, but I have no obligation to her or her baby." My mother called me a monster, told me I had no heart, that how could I be so selfish? What she didn't expect was for me to respond with everything I had kept, bottled up for years. I told her, "I'm selfish? I have no heart? Where was your heart when you kicked me out of my own house to please your boyfriend? Where was your compassion when you let Martin push me and yell at me? Where were your priorities when you excluded me from family outings and treated me like a stranger? You chose, Mom, you chose Martin and his kids over me, your only son, the son of the man you supposedly loved and who gave you a roof for almost 20 years. Now you live with the consequences of that decision." We both knew this conversation was going to happen eventually, and here we are. I gave her my final conditions, 2 weeks to completely vacate, and that was it. I wasn't going to negotiate anymore. Obviously, my mother didn't accept it quietly. She started calling all the family on her side, aunts, uncles, cousins. Everyone started bombarding me with messages telling me I was a horrible son, that I was being cruel, that family comes first, that I had to forgive and help. Some even threatened to never speak to me again, to which I basically responded that it was fine. that if they wanted to take the side of someone who had treated me so badly for so many years, that was their decision. What seemed most hypocritical to me was that none of these relatives, who were now calling me selfish, offered to help my mother find a place to live, or lend her money for rent, or temporarily take her into their homes. No, they all wanted me to be the one to solve the problem by giving away my property indefinitely. The 2 weeks passed, and they hadn't moved, so I had to proceed legally. My lawyer sent the official eviction papers and scheduled a date for the police to go supervise them vacating if they didn't do it voluntarily. 2 days before that date, my mother showed up at my grandparents' house, where I was still living because honestly I felt comfortable there and wasn't in a hurry to move, crying with her whole family, like 8 people, all trying to make me feel guilty. They told me they just needed more time, that 3 months, 6 months maximum, so Martin could find a better paying job and they could save up for an apartment deposit. I told them no, that they'd already had enough time, that this wasn't negotiable, and that if they didn't vacate in 48 hours, the police were going to go physically remove them. My aunt, my mother's sister, started yelling at me. What kind of man was I? That my father would be ashamed, and that made me explode. I yelled back at her not to dare mention my father, that he was the one who made the decision to leave me everything and my mother nothing for a reason, that clearly he knew my mother wasn't going to take good care of things, and that if anyone was honoring my father's memory, it was me by enforcing his wishes. I told them to leave my grandparents' property, or I was going to call the police myself. And eventually they left, but not without first telling me I had lost my family forever, that they were never going to forgive me, that I was going to end up alone and miserable. They finally vacated the house the day the police were going to go. At the last minute, they left the keys in the mailbox and took their things. When I went in to inspect the property, I found that they had left everything a mess, garbage everywhere, scratched walls. They had even broken some things intentionally as revenge. A window was broken, the main bathroom door had a hole in it, things like that. It cost me like $3,000 to fix all the damage they did. But honestly, I didn't care because I finally had my property back and could start doing with it what I had planned. I hired a contractor and started renovations about 2 months ago. I changed everything. New paint, new floors, fixed the yard, modernized the kitchen, and bathrooms, and now it looks incredible. Much better than when I lived there with my father, to be honest. My plan is to rent it to a family with good credit history and use that money along with the income from the other 2 properties to eventually buy my own place. Maybe a smaller house or a nice apartment close to work. My grandparents are super proud of me. They say I made the right decision and that my father would be happy to see that I'm finally taking control of my inheritance. My mother and I haven't spoken since the day of the eviction, about 2.5 months ago. I know from a cousin who still talks to me that she and Martin are renting a small apartment in a not-so-good area of the city, that Heather had her baby last month and is living with them, and that basically they're all cramped in a 2-bedroom space. Part of me, a very small part, feels something like guilt when I think about that, but then I remember everything they did to me, how they treated me, and that guilt evaporates quickly. They created this situation, not me. I'm just claiming what was always mine and doing what my father wanted me to do with his inheritance. Last week, my lawyer called to tell me that everything was legally finalized, that the property was completely under my control with no pending issues, and that I could proceed with whatever I wanted to do with it. I already have 2 families interested in renting it. Both seem like good options, and I'll probably make a decision this week. Knowing I'm going to have that additional income makes me feel more secure about my future, and honestly makes me feel like I'm finally honoring my father's memory the right way, taking care of what he worked so hard to get and leave me. I don't know if my mother and I will ever fix our relationship. If she ever genuinely apologizes for how she treated me, for kicking me out, for choosing Martin over me for so many years, maybe we could talk, but something tells me that's never going to happen. She's convinced I'm the villain of this story, that I'm the cruel son who threw his mother out on the street, and she'll probably tell that version to anyone who asks. But I know the truth, and the people who really matter to me, my grandparents, some close friends, they know the truth too, and that's enough for me right now.